I'm excited about this section because we had some wonderful conversation a couple of weeks ago when we're setting up this, and we may even have a little bit of good news from the West Coast, which will be nice. But I'd like to introduce Amaroq Weiss from the Center of Biological Diversity, Daniele Moser from oregonwild, and Lain Kahlstrom from animalwellnessaction. And we're going to talk a little bit about the West Coast, what's going on, and how we can help and what to look out for. So I guess, Amaroq, you're going to start, right? Is that right?
Yeah, I'll start.
All right.
So, hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Betsy and Steve and Paula and Timon for putting this together. We love how activist you guys are. You guys just rock. And the sessions that already happened today was some of the most inspiring stuff I've heard in a long time. There is a huge brain trust that you pulled together. So kudos to you. So we're going to be talking about West Coast wolves, and we're going to start with an overview of wolf populations and legal status. Danielle's going to talk about Oregon wolves, Lain's going to talk about Washington wolves, and I'm going to start us off with a brief discussion about both California wolves, but also Alexander Archipelago wolves, because sometimes we think we don't think further north when we think West Coast, but they're part of the West Coast too. So starting off with the Alexander Archipelago wolves, if you've seen some presentations on this animal before, you know that this is a unique subspecies of gray wolf, Canis lupus lygoni, and that they live on the coastal mainland and on nearly an archipelago that consists of nearly 1,000 or more islands in very remote southeast Alaska. And a lot of these wolves live on Prince of Wales Island. There are around 150 of them on Prince of Wales Island, and then there's several hundred more on the mainland. And these animals are really imperiled due to logging of old growth forest, largely in the Tongass National Forest, which is always under attack and is under attack again. The roads that are built for the logging trucks to come through are a hazard. And then the fact that it destroys their habitat, where these wolves actually den in the roots of old growth trees, and its main habitat for their chief prey, which is the Sitka black-tailed deer. So there's a combination of circumstances that really place these wolves in peril. The most of which, though, is that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game allows over excessive trapping of wolves in this region. So for the last 10 to 15 years, multiple groups, including the Center, have tried to get these wolves listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. We tried, I think, in 2009, again in 2013. And then last summer, the Center and allies, including a number of First Nations tribes in the region, petitioned U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to get them listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. We're still awaiting a decision on that. They have overly delayed, and it may turn out that we'll need to sue over that matter. And if there are any actions coming up the public can take, we will certainly keep you informed. So let's move way far south down to California, where, as Steve indicated, we actually have some good news for wolves on today's discussion. So since 2011, there are at least 40 wolves that I'm aware of that have either come into California and stayed, come into California and left, come into California and were poached, or came into California and not only stayed, but had pups, and then their pups became part of that 40 plus wolves tally that I'm aware of. And currently we have 9 confirmed wolves, and that consists of the 6 members of the Lain pack, which was California's second confirmed pack. Our first confirmed pack was in 2015, the Shasta pack, and they disappeared pretty quickly about 2 months after they were implicated in livestock conflicts. Many of us fear that they were poached. One of their subadult pups showed up a year later in Nevada, and we've not seen him since either. The Lain pack currently exists. They range across Lassen and Plumas County. They have about a 500 square mile territory, and there's at least 6 known members. The original breeding female, who came all the way from the Northern Rockies, her second mate, because her first mate disappeared after having 3 litters with her, and then some subadults and pups from last year. We have 2 new members of a new pair in California called the whaleback pair, named after a mountain in the region in Siskiyou County they're inhabiting. And this is another wolf from Oregon and an unknown lady friend who has not yet been identified. And then most of you probably know the good news about OR 93, the male wolf from the White River Pack in Western Oregon. He made a trek 300 miles down to the Oregon-California border, then another 500 miles down to Yosemite. And then beyond that, he's now in Fresno County. He's in central Fresno County in agricultural areas, and it's kind of flat open lands there. He's even crossed Highway 99, which is pretty concerning because that's like a 6-lane highway, one of our busiest highways in that part of the state. But as far as we know, he's still around and making international news. And as far as protections go for wolves in California, so like almost everywhere else in the country in January, they were federally delisted, but fortunately wolves in California are still state listed. They were petitioned for listing in 2012. The commission voted to do that. That became all finalized by 2017, although they've been protected from the moment they were identified as candidates. And so in California, under the State Endangered Species Act, it is illegal to hunt, pursue, catch, capture, kill, or attempt to do any of those to an endangered species. And so wolves cannot be killed in California except for in defense of human life. So moving back up north, Danielle, you want to take it over for Oregon?
Sure, thanks, Amaroq. Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Moser. I'm the Wildlife Program Coordinator for Oregon Wild, which is a state-based conservation organization. And before I give the overview of wolves in Oregon, I do just want to take a moment and acknowledge and pay respect to the indigenous people who have stewarded this land, otherwise known as Oregon, throughout the generations. For me specifically, I'm calling in from Portland, which is the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Kalapuya, Wasco, Molalla, Cowlitz, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, and many other tribes who made and still make their homes near the confluence of the Columbia and the Willamette rivers. So going into the overview of wolves in Oregon, obviously, like a lot of Western states, they were extirpated from our state, missing for a very long time. And one of our first sightings came in 1999 when a lone wolf came across the border from Idaho, was promptly captured and sent back over to Idaho by wildlife agents. And then in 2002, 2 wolves were found dead in the state, one killed by a car, the other illegally shot. From there, we start to see sort of a popcorning of wolves showing up in northeastern Oregon. And it was at that time, around 2005, where the first wolf plan was adopted, because I think agency officials realized wolves were here to stay and we cannot send every wolf back to Idaho. So every year since the adoption of this wolf plan, the state conducts an annual count just to get a sense of obviously how the wolf population is doing. I would say that this is not an estimate. There's a lot of species where they do modeling to get a sense of how the population is doing. For our wolf count, it's every wolf that is counted has actually either been seen, tracked, there's a photo of them. So it's actually a pretty conservative count when that comes out every year. So for our last population analysis, which was for 2019, which came out in 2020, in the spring of 2020, the state revealed that the population grew to 158 wolves in the state in 22 packs. The agency only identified 1 additional pack in Western Oregon, making it 3 packs in the western part of our state. To note, though, in 2019, the state, meaning state wildlife agency officials, did not kill any wolves in the state, which is the first time since 2014, which is a pretty big deal. And confirmed predations by wolves was actually decreased by 43%. So 2019 was a pretty good year for the overall numbers. A couple other things to note, though, of the 7 wolf mortalities, 5 were caused by vehicles. To me, that is such a staggering number, and really speaks to some issues with that even Amaroq alluded to with, major highways wolves trying to cross major highways across the state. And I think a lot of folks heard about the other note from our 2019 wolf count, which was our most famous wolf, OR7, aka Journey, was not documented in the annual count, likely meaning that his journey, sorry, no pun intended, had come to an end, which, you know, he was a pretty old wild wolf around the age of 10. So lived a full life and obviously was famous for being the first wolf into California in many, many years. But that was one thing that was also not revealed, I guess we could say, in the last wolf count. As far as legal status, in 2015, wolves were removed from the State Endangered Species Act, despite what peer-reviewed best available science was recommending. And then in a move that was, I want to say rare or almost perhaps never happens, after they were delisted by the commission, the Fish and Wildlife Commission, the next legislative session in 2016, the legislature affirmed the delisting. And they did this to moot out any litigation that groups like the Center and oregonwild were pursuing. And unfortunately, that worked. So wolves do not have State Endangered Species Act protections. And then, of course, as Amaroq said, because of the latest Trump decision before his departure, and we also now have no federal protections across Oregon for wolves. Okay, Lain, turn it over to you for Washington.
Great, thanks, Danielle. Yeah, the news in Washington is that, yes, you know, speaking of protections, the wolves in Washington also lost federal protections at the same time. They are still protected by the state, and I believe the most recent counts hover anywhere between 108 and 125 wolves. Wolves in Washington have been most heavily impacted by one rancher that's in the very northwest corner of the state, and they have been lethally removed by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife on a regular basis. So that's a little bit about the Washington wolf status currently. Should we go on to the policy?
Danielle, I think that's you.
Yes.
That is me. I'm so sorry. I'm messing with my Zoom window here and didn't realize we were moving right on. Yes, so policies and laws that affect wolf recovery and conservation happen across several different branches of government and through some public processes. So I'm going to describe the role and impacts of state legislatures and commissions, which oversee state wildlife agencies. Next, Lain will discuss how this plays out with the federal agencies. And then Amaroq will describe how public advisory groups at the state level are used by agencies in ways that impact state wolf policies. So diving right into sort of the state legislature 101. In my experience, you know, when I ask folks where they think important policies that guide wolf recovery come from, a lot of folks list Congress, which isn't untrue. And it's, you know, quite common for folks to really have that mindset of, oh my gosh, when I'm thinking about laws and legislation, I think of Congress at the federal level. But I would say that, you know, a lot of things that impact wolf recovery and management actually happen at the state level, both with the legislature and then with administrative policy, which I'll get into. So let's start with the legislature first. Of course, my frame of reference is Oregon, so I'm going to speak to that, but this is pretty much true across the country, of course, with some slight variation. So without doing a full Schoolhouse Rocks on how a bill becomes a law and all the different chambers of the legislature, I do at least want to get us all on the same page so that we can understand the different access points for influence in this whole political world that we play in. So just like at the federal level, everyone has a state representative, or sometimes called an assembly member, and a senator. I want to underscore that they work for you. I know it can feel a bit daunting to engage in the political process. And obviously not all of our representatives do a good job of representing our values, but the fact of the matter is they should be accessible to you and they technically work for you. So how a bill becomes a law. I've gone through and through, how do I boil this down as quickly as I can? And the reason I want to explain a little bit of this, again, is to show how there's just all these different points where things can go sideways, quite frankly. So if a bill is introduced in the House, for example, it gets assigned to a committee. Then it has a public hearing and a vote in that committee. From there, it then has to go to the floor for a full vote in that chamber. So again, if it originates in the House, it then has to go to the full House for a vote. If it passes, then it goes to the other chamber, meaning if it started in the House, it goes to the Senate. If it started in the Senate, it goes to the House. From there, it also has to go through a committee, have a vote, have a public hearing, have a vote, and then a full floor vote. So at several moments throughout this process, amendments can be brought forward. Obviously, lots of different people are trying to influence that piece of legislation. And then before a final passage, especially if there's different versions of these bills, they have to go into reconciliation to work out the kinks and get the same bill for a final vote before it goes to the governor. It's a lot to process, and sometimes it is complicated. But that's why groups like Oregon Wild and the Center and many others are really tracking what's going on at this legislative level and trying to help people understand where they can most influence. So, I think if you're a public advocate, the best thing to know is that you can reach out to your legislator, you can ask for meetings, you can show your support or opposition of a bill. And it's really important that you do that because, again, just listening to how a bill has to become a law, how a bill becomes a law, you can see that there's so many different points where things, again, can go sideways, that there's points for access for others to lobby, for opposition and everything. So, and especially when it comes to wildlife and wolves, often we see this legislation used as trading stock, meaning, and when I talked about that one bill that affirmed the delisting of wolves in Oregon, that was a really unfortunate moment in which urban Democrats used that bill to trade for votes on a transportation bill with rural Republicans. And we see that over and over again. And so I just want to underscore the importance of your advocacy, because that's what helps us ensure that people care about wildlife. And again, they're not using it to trade, and they're really making sure we're doing things that benefit the state's fish and wildlife. So that's kind of the rundown of the legislature. And again, they have, of course, a lot of influence on what happens around wolf policy, just like they did with the delisting, and of course, setting lots of different recommendations on things that guide recovery. Now let's pivot to the other decision-making body that I talked about, the Fish and Wildlife Commission, or otherwise sometimes known as the Fish and Game Commission. And I have to say, before I became a wildlife advocate, I didn't realize how important a Fish and Wildlife Commission was. I think it actually can't be overstated that this is sometimes the most important decision-making body when it comes to wolves. So this commission has the authority to make rules and guidelines that are legally binding. They go through a rulemaking process, and this is the same as passing a law in the legislature. So it's legally binding, and it has a lot of direct impact for wolf recovery, just like the wolf delisting decision. That's a major one that these commissions, take a look at and decide on. So other things that they do, they set guidelines and recommendations on protections for different species. They set hunting, fishing, trapping seasons. They determine what these different recovery and management plans will look like. So they're just really important. And at least in Oregon, it's a seven individual body. These folks are appointed by the governor and confirmed by the state Senate. It's volunteer based, so you can request a meeting with them. I've recommended to people that you try to bunch up and do one big group meeting if you can, just because they're not as accessible, in my experience, as legislators, but they're still accessible, and you can still tell them through written testimony or give an oral testimony at a public hearing, what you care about, and they really need to hear from you. So I think that I'll probably stop there because I'm probably running over my time, but they're just incredibly important. And I just want to emphasize the role of the legislature and the role of administrative policy in determining what happens to wolves.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. I think you're so right, because, as we see with other states, so much does depend on that state's fish and game agency. It cannot be understated. But I do want to say a little bit about the federal agencies that are involved. And as we all know on this call, and in this seminar, the Trump administration rolled back the rule delisting wolves across their range. And so that belongs to the Department of Interior, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is part of the Department of Interior. And when they delisted wolves across the contiguous United States, that left all wolf management up to the states, which is actually a pretty scary proposition to be in, because as we all know, with the exception of California, states really cannot be trusted to manage their wolf populations in a way that is that most non-consumptive users would want to see. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is supposed to be making decisions on federal delisting based on sound science. And what we've seen is that that's not necessarily the case. That's not necessarily what's happened, because they have deemed that the wolves are recovered in various pockets, but have not looked at the entire contiguous range that they used to inhabit. So there's some question about the science that they used in determining whether or not the wolves should be delisted. Even so, the USDA and Wildlife Services is still allowed to kill wolves if there are conflicts with wolves. And as a result, we still see Wildlife Services doing lethal wolf removal. So yeah, that's according to the federal level ESA. So it's a little bit about the federal agencies are involved. And I think, Amaroq, you were going to talk about the advisory group level.
Yeah, so just to emphasize a point that Danielle made, that these different agencies are called by different names. Sometimes it's called a Fish and Wildlife Agency, sometimes it's called a Fish and Game Agency. In the Midwest, a number of those agencies are called Natural Resources Department. And so all of them, however, have a commission or an oversight board of some kind. It might be called the Natural Resources Board, the Fish and Game Commission, the Fish and Wildlife Commission. But just so you know that these exist in every state, there will be an oversight commissioner board, and then there will be an agency that they oversee. And the agency are supposed to be doing stuff on the ground. The oversight board or commission is supposed to be making policy, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just listen to whatever their people on the ground say, and then they just nod their head, and then they do whatever they say, when they should, in fact, be using science to set policy for their agencies. But one of the things that we see repeatedly in all of these states, no matter what the names are of the agency or the board, is the use of a public advisory group to assist the agency in developing a wolf plan, revising or updating a wolf plan, or implementing portions of a currently existing wolf plan. And although these groups in theory sound like a great idea, what I actually want to point out in my remarks here is that there are a lot of pitfalls with these groups. If you have an opportunity to be selected to be on one of these groups, or you apply to be on one of these groups, terrific. You also need to know what you're getting into and what points of inflection there are for you to be able to try to influence that process. So I'm going to go through, there's probably 24 pitfalls I could list, but I'm going to try to limit myself to 10 or less. Okay, so first one is these groups often do not give science its due. Too often we see that participants in public advisory groups are able to just provide input that are basically opinions without any scientific support for what their opinion is. And then the agency staff rarely, if ever, steps in to correct and say, that's just flat out wrong. That is not what the data shows. And so very often the input can be based on rumors, it can be based on opinions, and those are held on equal footing with opinions with input that comes in that's grounded in science. And so that's one. Another one is inadequate facilitation. If you don't have a highly skilled facilitator running these groups, what happens is that interest groups can take over these meetings and they force their own agenda. One topic, one person, one identity group can commandeer the group's entire time and energy. And oftentimes the facilitator may be someone who already works for the department, which is really inappropriate because the department itself is a stakeholder. You have to have an outside facilitator, but we've also seen instances of outside facilitation go terribly, terribly wrong. Just because you have a facilitator doesn't mean they know what they're doing or that what they're doing is going to be a good outcome for wolves. We almost always see, I'm not even going to say almost, we always see inequitable and unbalanced representation. We see these stacked public advisory groups that overrepresent what we call traditionalist values, which is often from the hunting and trapping and livestock portion of society, as opposed to what academics call mutualist values, people who view wildlife as part of our social network. And so what results from these stacked groups is that their views drive the conversations, their views determine the outcomes, and these more mutualist or pro-wolf views are just shunted aside, science is brushed aside, and oftentimes the agencies will convene groups where they just pick representatives from 3 different groups: livestock groups, hunter and trapper groups, and environmental groups. The problem is that the livestock groups and the hunter and trapper groups vote as a block. So you've already got a 2-to-1 stacked interest group situation right there. A lot of times these groups cut the public out of the decision making. And it is really important in these groups to be able to build social cohesion and have some dialogue to try to understand each other. But it's also really important that the public be involved so that these advisory groups aren't making all the decisions for the publics, because repeatedly we see the groups are not equitable, they're not inclusive enough, they do not include the broad diversity of opinions and people who are out in society. Repeatedly, we see these groups prioritize process and internal group relationships over successful conservation outcomes for wolves. And yes, understanding each other, learning from each other is important, but if what comes out at the end of that process is bad conservation outcomes for wolves, then and that often is the case, because what will often happen in these situations are compromises that are based on relationships as opposed to based on science. You have lack of accountability coming out of these groups. Continually, what will happen is products will come out of these decision-making groups that don't hold agencies accountable to make sure that non-lethals were used first. Don't hold livestock owners accountable to make sure that non-lethals were used first. And so you end up with wolves being killed with no kind of enforcement or accountability because of what came out of that process. We do often see, too, the tendency of wolf advocate representatives to compromise. In wolf planning stakeholder processes, we repeatedly see wolf advocate representatives who are striving to understand the other side, who are repeatedly putting forward options. Danielle's going to remember this from our Oregon update process, where the environmental groups were the only ones that put forward options for the whole group to discuss. And yet we just got tanked in that process and ended up walking out of it because it was so clear how biased and counterproductive it was for wolves. And so what we often see, and so we didn't do what I'm about to tell you is a pitfall, is seeing conservation groups who are willing to compromise science and equity and ethics concerns in order to reach a compromise. And so this goes to this really fundamental pitfall with the stakeholder groups, and that is that the agencies think that the way these should operate is through a consensus-based process. But what the academics will tell you is that consensus-based processes help make things stay the status quo. If the status quo right now is traditionalist viewpoints and managements of wildlife, consensus-based processes tend to support things staying that way. What academics suggest instead of consensus is something called an argument analysis-based type of process, in which you put down what are your conclusions, and then you go back and you take that conclusion apart premise by premise, and you determine, does that conclusion actually have a good scientific premise that underlies it? And that's a much better way to make sure that your end product is science-based, is going to have a successful conservation outcome, and isn't just based on opinions and rumors. It's got a firm basis in fact. And then lastly, one other really big pitfall we often see is in these groups, the agencies will try to get the groups, or some members of the group will want to see caps on wolf populations or zones in the state where there can be wolves and other zones where wolves aren't going to be allowed, or a trade-off where, okay, wolves will be allowed everywhere, but we're going to have really low recovery goals. And so it's really important for wolf conservation that the products that come out of these stakeholder groups is to see wolves at their full ecological functional population levels, you know, not with caps, not with zones, not with trade-offs. And so if you do get to be in one of these processes, great, go for it. You are there to speak for wolves. You are not there to make compromises. You may find that there's places where compromises make sense because they're based on science and they're still based on your values and principles, but your job there is to be a voice for wolves. So just beware of some of these pitfalls and go for it. And yeah, okay. So next section. Oh, heck, I'm supposed to start up the next section. Okay, I'm going to keep talking. So our next section is the events that are happening or coming up soon that we all need to be paying attention to. So I'm going to talk about something that's happening in Washington soon. Last year, the Center Wild Earth Guardians, Western Watersheds Project, and Cascadia Wildlands submitted a petition to the Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission, urging them to enact a public rulemaking process to create enforceable, transparent, accountable rules for how wolf livestock issues will be managed by the agency. This is not the first time we've done it. This time, again, they denied our petition, but we appealed it to the governor, and the governor granted our petition. He reversed the commission's decision and said, Commission, you've got to enact rules, because if you've been paying attention to Washington's situation, you already know that the year before the governor said, hell no, all this killing in Northeast Washington has got to stop. He didn't actually say hell no, but he did say no. He said it's absolutely unacceptable. And so we were very pleased that he reversed the commission's decision. He directed them to start a rulemaking process. So what that means is the agency is putting together draft rules language that they're going to put out to the public this summer for public comment. We submitted sample rules language that we suggested they follow. We know what they're going to come out with is going to be very watered down compared to what we suggested. When it comes out, you're going to get alerts from all of us working on Washington wolves to be involved. We will need you to submit written comments. We will need you to testify. It's probably going to be on Zoom, but we definitely need the public involvement in this, because as I said, whatever they're going to come out with is going to be really watered down, and we're going to have to push really hard to try to get rules and regulations that make sense for wolves. So that will be coming up for Washington. We think sometime this summer will be the start of that public process. And Danielle, what do you got for us for Oregon?
Thanks, Amaroq. And yeah, before I talk about specific opportunities to engage, I did just want to say, I meant to say it earlier, especially with the legislature, in addition to setting up meetings, you can also sign up for alert notifications about a bill you might want to track. So at least in Oregon, I assume that's true for every other state, is that instead of just signing up for full legislative updates every day, which can be very overwhelming, you can actually tailor it to specific bills or committees that you want to track. So that's another way that you can pay attention at the legislative level. And then just a quick plug, and Amaroq kind of alluded to it, one of the best ways you can find out about these opportunities is signing up with organizations like Oregon Wild and others. At least for us, we even have an activist group that I help train and prepare to give testimony and to submit written comment. So, and then of course, alert you to opportunities at the commission level, at the state level, and the congressional level. So if you're just too overwhelmed with the idea of signing up and tracking all of this, just sign up with my organization, and then you'll know about everything going on in Oregon. Okay, so specific things are coming down the pike pretty immediately. Actually, this one is within the next week. On the legislative front, surprisingly, there's actually one bill that we're concerned about this session, which is quite frankly a breath of fresh air, because we're usually like looking at 5 or 6 different versions of things that are trying to get at wolf recovery and management. So this is only one, and it's Senate Bill 642. It's a bill to increase the wolf compensation fund. And I believe you have already gotten a one-pager from us, so that's already referenced there, and there's a link to how to provide written testimony. But so the wolf compensation fund, I mean, on the surface, it doesn't sound awful. It's essentially a fund for doling out money to livestock operators who have had losses due to wolf predation. And, you know, the challenge, at least in Oregon, is that those funds have been misused, they've been abused, they've been wasted. There's been a lack of focus on non-lethal, and not to mention that there's also been sort of a lack of uniformity in the process, just how livestock operators even apply to get funds. It's different county by county. So it's kind of a mess. And so they want to increase this from 100,000 to 800,000, you know, general fund dollars going out for the compensation fund. And we feel like without major reforms to the program, we do not support giving more money to do business as usual. Especially if you couple that with the fact that we have reduced protections for wolves in Oregon, it just does not make sense at this time to dole out more money. So if you're interested, you know, you can submit just a written comment to the committee, excuse me, this is starting in the Senate, the Natural Resources and Wildfire Committee. And you can say simply, I don't support increasing this fund without major reform, period. And I meant to put it in the document. There's actually a great investigative report on the compensation fund and all these different things that I just talked about, all these different abuses of the fund. I believe it was done by Oregon Public Broadcasting, OPB. So if you look that up in wolf compensation, you should be able to find it if you want more information about the background on that. This is another, as far as things coming down the pike, you know, things are actually a bit quiet for wolves in Oregon, which is a good thing. So this is actually a good time to familiarize yourself with the wolf conservation and management plan. As Amaroq has alluded to, this is the single most important document guiding wolf recovery and management in the state. In Oregon, it was most recently updated and revised in 2019. So the next update won't be for a few years, which is why it's kind of a good time to just read the plan, understand what the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife should be doing is in way of implementation. I recommend you familiarize yourself with the chapters and appendices on wolf livestock interactions and wolf ungulate interactions, as these two are the main reasons the state cites for killing wolves. So more to come on that. We're going to have another section on sort of future things, but I would say dive into that if you can, while things are a bit quiet in Oregon. And then finally, as far as something you could do right from this meeting, right from this conference, and it might feel a little removed, but it's actually extremely important, which is the next round of appointments to Oregon's Fish and Wildlife Commission. I didn't dive too far into this just because I was trying to be conscious of time, but you know, this 7 individual bodied commission, obviously, they're not supposed to represent constituencies and special interests, but we know that ends up being what happens. And so we're constantly battling to get folks who respect best available science and the public's broad values and opinions on, you know, different wildlife related issues. And so, you know, here's 2 more opportunities in Oregon to appoint better people to this commission, because I can tell you firsthand, you can bring forward the best science, you can bring forward the best polling and more testimony than anybody else. And the fact of the matter is, if you have decision makers on these commissions who don't see the value in that, who ignore the science, you're always going to have an uphill battle. So I actually focus a lot of my time and energy on who are going to be appointed to these commissions. So sign up for Oregon Wild's list. I don't mean to plug that too many times, but I'll be sending out information next week when this person's name goes live, because as of right now, the person we're hoping will be on the commission, from what we're told, this woman, Kathayun Khalil, she's supposed to be the next nomination, but things can always get messed up in politics. So if you want an update about what to do next on that, email me, sign up for our alerts, and you'll find out next week. But that's a really important thing you can do soon. Lain?
Great. Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, similarly in Washington, things are mercifully a little bit quiet on the wolf front, which is fantastic given the carnage that took place there last year, again, mostly due to that one rancher in the northeast corner of the state. But since Governor Inslee directed the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to more thoroughly consider other options, thankfully, a lot of that activity has ground to a halt or slowed significantly. But what's coming up in the very near term are the WAG meetings, and the WAG is the Wolf Advisory Group. WDFW, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, relies very heavily on the WAG to provide them input, and the WAG is made up of a broad array of individuals and stakeholders who are supposed to come to consensus, and Amaroq already talked about some of the pitfalls of that kind of process, and we've certainly seen that be true of the WAG as well, where the WAG has wound up being something of a greenwash for the WDFW in terms of their blessing the plans that they have to eliminate wolves. But it is still strongly recommended to attend WAG meetings. They go on for 2 days at a time. The public can attend and the public can give comment. So it is important to attend those and know who those people are, as well as attending the WDFW commissioners meetings. Those are also very important. I should note that Jay Inslee did just recently appoint 2 new commissioners out of the 9 who are far more representative of Washingtonians more broadly than just ranching, hunting interests. So I would say under Governor Inslee, things are somewhat improved, and I think he is putting pressure on and making sure that the most recent appointees to the commission are people that should be there. But it is very, very important to get to know all of the commissioners and all of the WAG members and attend every one of those meetings that you can and provide comment.
Thanks. I think it's me next if I
think so.
See our notes. Okay. So now we're going to quickly talk about potential opportunities that are likely arising in the future. So obviously I talked about the Wolf Conservation and Management Plan in Oregon. There's always efforts when we're under another revision to make it easier to kill wolves, especially as we move towards the population getting bigger and bigger. As of today, a public hunting and trapping season is not allowed in Oregon. However, it isn't out of the realm of possibility, especially in a future revision. I want to say that despite Oregon and the broader West Coast's green reputation, when it comes to wildlife and natural resources, especially for Oregon, this is still a bit the wild, wild west. And I just want to say that folks should not discount the influence of agriculture, timber, and other special interests that they have on wildlife policy. So, it's probably not as likely to see a huge open season hunt and trap soon, but it's not out of the realm of possibilities. So I would say that's something to keep an eye out for when the next revision happens. There's other things related to, especially as I mentioned that, 5 wolf mortalities were caused by vehicles. I would say, there have been a lot of efforts at the state level and at the federal level to better fund and study and implement safe wildlife crossings and passage and corridors and just, general protection of habitat. And I think that's going to be really, really important in Oregon because most of our population is still clustered in the Northeast. And so if we really want to see wolves starting to disperse out, other than just OR 93 and the ones kind of here and there, we're going to need to really ensure that we have the ability for wolves to cross major highways and roads. And then, of course, just keeping an eye out, every legislative session, there's usually one or more anti-wolf bills. This year's pretty mild, perhaps because of COVID and just the legislature being a bit overwhelmed with new process on Zoom and how to do everything. So maybe less bills are going through, but pretty much expect that almost every year that some anti-wolf somebody is going to introduce something. So yeah, I would say those are really the main things that we're going to keep an eye out here. And then of course, who gets appointed to this Fish and Wildlife Commission. It's actually just dawned on me too that, so right now the way our commission is set up is it's, like I said, 7 people, 5 come from the 5 congressional districts, and then there's 1 Western at large and 1 Eastern at large. But with the next census and changing of congressional districts, Oregon is going to get another seat, just because the population's been growing and people are flocking to Oregon. And so we're actually going to get another member of Congress, which means the commission actually wouldn't actually be in line with the law. So some of us are starting to think about, do we want a different setup even for our commission, just given the change of that. So anyway, something to keep an eye out for. And yeah, that's what I got for Oregon. Okay, great. Well, for Washington, what I would want to say, what I would say is, as long as we have Governor Inslee, we're not likely to see wolf hunting or trapping be allowed anytime soon under his administration, but that can change very, very quickly. As we all know, a change in the administration could have pretty dire consequences for wolves. But as long as we've got Governor Inslee, I think from that side of things, we're probably pretty well safe. That said, I still think there are things to do. We mentioned getting to know your fish and wildlife commissioners, and Danielle talked about getting to know your state legislators, getting to know the WAG in Washington State. All of those are really critical. And of course, also, as we mentioned, during this comparatively quiet time compared to other parts of the country, reading the Wolf Conservation Management Plan and knowing it well. And if you want to write to Governor Inslee, I think there are 2 main points to ask him about. One is to continue to pressure WDFW to use the non-lethal measures and to adopt the new regulation language that CBD and other groups are putting forward in their petition this summer. I think those would be important things that he could support. And then as a follow-on, he can continue to appoint commissioners to that commission that are like the last 2, that are going to represent more broadly the interests of Washingtonians and not just selective ranching and hunting interests. And then lastly, all of these groups that you see here, Animal Wellness Action, Oregon Wild, CBD, all of these groups, and from the other groups that have been speaking today, we all put out action alerts. Those are important to follow and to share that information with your network, because as much as you can help spread the word to your people, and get them to take action with us, that helps all of us. So I would keep an eye on the leading thinkers on this space and make sure you're signed up for updates and share those broadly.
And I'll close out our session with some comments on Alexander Archipelago wolves and California wolves. So for Alexander Archipelago wolves, as I indicated, right now we're really at the stage where we're waiting to get a response from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Without federal protections, these wolves are subject to being trapped again through a season set by Alaska Department of Fish and Game. So keep tuned for our alerts as well as to whether or not we're going to have to be commenting with the Alaska Fish and Game Commission. With respect to California wolves, I don't think we will ever see wolf hunting or wolf trapping in the state. What I do think we might see over time is that as we have more wolves come into the state, as we have any livestock conflicts develop between wolves and livestock, and there have been some already, we may see some effort on the part of the livestock industry to try to push to amend the State Endangered Species Act so as to allow killing of wolves for livestock conflicts. Currently, the way the State Endangered Species Act reads is there are instances in which one can get an incidental take permit to kill an endangered species if it's in the process of a scientific or education or management purpose. But the balancing factor against that, because you might think, oh, well, management, somebody should be able to get an incidental take permit to be able to kill a wolf to manage conflicts. The balancing factor in the act is that it says any take has to be fully mitigated and it can't at all jeopardize the recovery of the species. And because California wolves are such in the infancy of their population, we have so few wolves here that if you killed even one of them for management purposes, you wouldn't be able to mitigate it, and it would jeopardize the recovery of the species. So, at some point, it may be that livestock industry folks are going to try to push legislators to try to amend the State Endangered Species Act to do away with that provision or make it more liberal for the ability to kill wolves. But I still think that's a long ways off. But that's the one thing I think that we could see sometime in the future And just reminding everybody what everybody else here has said as well in terms of action alerts, the document that we all put together that I know that the folks here that are conducting this satellite workshop will put in the notes, or they've already sent out to all of you, has all the different links for how you can get on the email list for the commissions in each of the 3 West Coast states, so you will know when they have meetings and what's on the agenda. There's links in there also for each of the state agencies, so you can get on their update list to get emails when they've got new wolf information to release in either Oregon or Washington or California. And then something that we haven't really talked about here is, public viewpoints matter, and not everybody in the world cares about wolves, but they'll care more about them if they hear about it from you. Somebody earlier on today's workshop mentioned that besides obituaries, the next most read portion in media, whether it's online or in your hand paper, is the letters to the editor. So please write letters to the editor in all of these West Coast states. We don't think we're going to see here what we've seen in the Northern Rockies in the West Coast, but my God, I grew up in Iowa and I never expected to see in the Western Great Lakes states what we're seeing today. So you should never say never, and always use your opportunity to write letters to the editor. If somebody writes a wolf article and it's got positive and accurate information about wolves in it, write a letter to the editor and thank them for writing about wolves, and say why wolves are important and why you want them back in your state. If they write an article that's got negative things about wolves or inaccurate information, write a letter to the editor, thank them for writing about wolves, and say, however, what you wrote here was incorrect. Here's the correct information, and here's why we need wolves. Because other members of the public who don't care about wolves, don't know about wolves, they're going to read your letter, and you are going to be building the activist network that we need to keep expanding to keep wolves protected. So I think that covers our talk. There's still some time for questions.
You guys did that so well. It was very well choreographed, guys.
Very thorough. I don't see any questions in the chat. I just have one quick question. I know Paul has one, right?
Yeah, go first.
You go first.
Okay, I'll go first. So I know when you were talking about the 5 wolves, I just want to be clear because someone else was also asking about the 5 wolves reported recently that were killed. That's not the same 5 wolves, right?
Are you talking about for Oregon?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so there were 5 wolves that were recently announced that they died. I don't think we've even identified that they were killed yet. So there's not much information. And yeah, they're out of Union County, and it looks like they were one of the wolves that had a collar on it sent ODFW a mortality signal, which is what flagged them to, there's a problem. And so they found the wolves on February 9th, and it's still at the forensics lab. So based on that, usually if it's poached by shot, obviously they know that there was a gunshot wound. So there's some speculation, maybe poison, maybe parvovirus, something else, but yeah, it's still, you all know about as much as we know, unfortunately, on that one.
And that is separate from the 5 wolves that were killed the year before from vehicle strikes.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
That's right. Yeah. No, that was the thing. It was like, wait a second, because I knew that I had read the article, and then I we're talking about 5 and 5, and then I saw a couple of people asking in the chat. So I just wanted to clarify.
I apologize.
We were no, it's okay.
Yeah.
I was just hoping that you had more information for us, because I know everybody's very curious about what happened to those wolves.
Yep. No, those 5 were from the same pack. The other 5 that were killed by vehicles were all over the state. Yep.
Can I just say something about that too? Because I've been getting a lot of questions about this. I assume people watching now have the same questions. Why did it take them so long to, why did it take so long to even announce it? And why is it taking so long to find the results? So it's taking them a long time to announce it. In part because they're law enforcement, and law enforcement doesn't automatically, in a wildlife potential poaching case, a wildlife investigation, want to immediately alert the public to what happened. Because a lot of times, if these crimes get solved, I'm saying this as a former criminal defense attorney, I'm not just making this up. A lot of times, if these cases are going to get solved at all, it may be because somebody who did it is bragging at a bar, they're drunk, they're bragging to their buddies, or somebody who was with them mentions it. And so what they're trying not to do is alert the public that this happened, with the hopes of following up on leads to get some evidence before the leads dry up. And a lot of times we won't find out that something happened until the leads have dried up and then they've decided to make it public. And then as far as being able to know the cause of death, usually I think we'll all agree what we've seen is if the wolf was killed by gunshot, that usually is said right away. So everybody knows that. But if it isn't clear how they died, they have to go for a necropsy, forensic analysis at a forensic wildlife lab. And there aren't that many wildlife forensics labs in the United States. And they've got stacks of other cases they're already working on when they come in. So sometimes those wolves' bodies end up being in a freezer for a little while until their forensics analysts can get to that and really thoroughly examine what the cause of death was. So there are a variety of legitimate reasons as to why the information doesn't come out as quickly as we'd like it to.
And there's another question in the chat here. I wonder why the breaking of the law when a wolf is killed illegally get let off so lightly. Any response to that?
Yeah, like 50 responses. I think. Well, because what I was going to say, Amaroq, too, is I think what you laid out are the legitimate reasons. The other sort of legitimate but shouldn't be a legitimate reason is that, I find it also interesting that a lot of anti-wolf people seem to have inside tracks on these poaching incidents. And it does make me wonder law enforcement and the connection to some of these folks on the ground. So there's sometimes this inner working of, in Oregon, the Oregon State Police, perhaps not prioritizing a wolf poaching. And yeah, because quite frankly, I've seen a number of poachings of elk or deer or other species, and that gets out there pretty fast. So there's definitely just sometimes a little bit of a support sometimes from different folks in these counties. And that's why they're not, going to heavily prosecute as much.
We also will see like hunters who are willing to turn in other hunters for poaching elk and deer, but not quite so willing to do that for poached wolves. But the other thing too is with the poached deer and elk, they're always shot. And so when OSP issues a notice, they're immediately able to say, and if you can get it on the OSP listserv, and you can get their updates every day. And you will see in Oregon, like every day there are elk and deer that are found that have been poached. But they've clearly been shot, so they've clearly been poached, so they can report that right away. But yeah, in terms of why don't they just get slap on the wrist? It's not a high priority. And so that actually goes into another bill that's pending in Oregon. It's at 841, Senate Bill 841, to fully fund the environment. It's an environmental investigative law enforcement branch. And that needs to be fully funded. So that's another bill that we're all tracking and lending support to.
Yeah.
And we just saw that the Montana governor just killed a wolf and he was barely slapped on the wrist. And this is sadly what happens with wolves.
Yeah,
a lot of people out there that don't mind seeing them disappear.
Yeah. And I would say two more things to the light slap on the wrist. First of all, we tend to see a trend where when you remove endangered species protections for this animal, you see an increase in poaching because it sends a signal to the public that we don't value this species as much anymore. And so that's kind of one thing. It's sort of, a little bit more abstract, but it does actually result. I mean, you can actually see how people say, well, this no longer, if this doesn't have ESA protections, it's devalued. I'm not going to, the book's not going to get thrown at me if I poach one of these. The other thing, and I think somebody else alluded to it, I mean, you can say, oh, I thought it was a coyote. You can say self-defense. I know in Oregon, somebody got off for self-defense. And actually, when we did a public records request and we got the information, they claimed, I thought the wolf was running at me and I was scared. So they shot at it and killed the wolf. And when we got the public records back, they shot the wolf the wrong way. The wolf would have been running away. They shot it in the back hind. So it's like, that's not even a legitimate thing based on where you shot this animal. So there's a number of reasons. And, you know, I think the coyote one is what, the McKittrick policy. You can basically say, oh, I thought it was a coyote, and get off scot-free. So there's just a lot of different things, but it all boils down to sort of devaluing this species.
Yeah.
Guys,
I think it's 4 o'clock.
thank you so much. This was incredible.